A millionaire escaped to Paris with his mistress, believing he'd finally silenced his past. But as luxury wrapped around him, a quiet force was working in the shadows. When security knocked at his door and his card stopped working, he realized his ex-wife hadn't disappeared. She was preparing the final move. There was something about the way the sun dipped behind the Paris skyline that made everything feel unreal, as if time had slowed down just for them. The clink of crystal glasses echoed in the penthouse suite of Hotel Georges V, blending with the faint hum of a jazz trio playing softly in the private lounge downstairs. Miles Grant, millionaire entrepreneur and poster child for American ambition, leaned back in a plush velvet chair near the terrace, savoring the view and the moment. His mistress, Ava, draped in a champagne-colored silk gown, laughed at something he said, her fingers delicately swirling the wine in her glass, her legs crossed just right to flash the silver of her heels. He had done it. Escaped. Not just from the monotony of board meetings and the gray grip of obligation, but from Elise, his ex-wife, the woman who once shared this life with him, now nothing more than a closed chapter in a book he no longer cared to reread. Elise had become a weight around his neck, always asking for clarity, always questioning his deals, his nights out, his growing distance. So he blocked her on his phone, his email, his office line. She'd find out eventually that he was done, but for now, he had more pressing matters to attend to, like showing Ava the very best of Paris. They had arrived that morning on a private jet, the kind that reeked of leather and overconfidence. Champagne had been popped before the wheels even left the tarmac in New York, and now, the city of lights sprawled beneath them, a playground for indulgence. Ava, nearly 15 years his junior, looked at Miles like he was invincible, like the world bent at his command. That was the thing he loved most about her, how her admiration made him feel important again. He poured more wine into her glass, then lifted his to clink against hers. "To us," he whispered, his voice thick with charm. She smiled, that curated, sultry smile he had seen her wear when they first met at a launch party. She had been the PR manager for a French skincare brand his company had just acquired. It had taken him exactly 2 days to convince her to abandon her post and join him in Monaco. 2 weeks later, they were inseparable. At least, that was what she believed. For Miles, women were just seasonal accessories, rotated, displayed, admired, but never really loved. Ava leaned over the arm of the chair, brushing her lips across his ear. "You're finally free, huh?" she purred, and he chuckled low in his throat. "Elise was holding me back," he said, eyes fixed on the darkened city beyond the glass. "Now, it's just us and the world." Back in New York, Elise sat quietly at a small, oak desk, surrounded by silence that was heavier than any scream. The sun hadn't yet risen, but she was awake, had been awake since 4:15 a.m. She didn't need to check his social media. The lawyer had already shown her the photos. Miles never did anything quietly, and that included leaving her. She wasn't even granted the dignity of a conversation. One day he stopped coming home. The next, his lawyer had emailed a notice of separation. By the time Elise tried to call him, she was already blocked. But what Miles didn't know was that Elise had spent the last decade learning more from him than he realized. He had thought she was too passive, too traditional to understand how his empire worked. In reality, she had been studying him like a textbook. Every transaction, every shady international deal, every time he blurred the lines between personal and professional finances. She never planned on using it. She had trusted him once, had built a life with him, imagined children, summer homes, legacies. But when trust evaporated and the air turned bitter, Elise shifted. She clicked open her laptop, and a folder titled Miles, Offshore Accounts, blinked at her. She had collected everything. She didn't want revenge. That wasn't her nature. But she wasn't going to be discarded like a pair of out-of-season shoes, either. Miles was arrogant enough to believe she would crumble. That without his name, his network, and his money, she would fade into irrelevance. He had no idea she had already met with a financial crimes attorney and a forensic accountant. They had prepared everything for her. An international asset freeze wasn't just a threat, it was ready for execution. All they needed was for Miles to move more than $50,000 of corporate funds into personal use. And Paris? Well, Paris was expensive. Back in the hotel suite, Miles scrolled through his corporate banking app with one hand, while Ava showed him a boutique on her phone she wanted to visit the next day. He transferred $10,000 to the hotel concierge account to hold their private driver. Then another $5,000 to Ava's personal account. His company had more than enough liquidity to fund their week-long escapade. The board wouldn't notice a thing. They never did. And even if they asked, he'd call it client entertainment. It was a gray area, but Miles had always lived comfortably in the gray. "I want to take you on a hot air balloon ride over the Loire Valley," he said casually, kissing her neck. She giggled and whispered something about how romantic he was. He smiled, proud. Elise never appreciated gestures like that. She was always asking if a purchase was tax-deductible. In the early hours of the next morning, Miles was still asleep, one arm sprawled across Ava's bare waist, the city slowly waking outside their suite. But 3 floors down, at the front desk, a tall woman in a sleek navy pantsuit handed a thick envelope to the manager. Her name tag read, Interbank Liaison, Cour de Paris. "This is urgent," she said in crisp English. "Suite 510. Immediate delivery." The hotel staff nodded. They were used to important guests receiving sensitive documents. What they weren't used to was the red seal on the envelope, a judicial crest. Upstairs, Ava opened her eyes first. She reached for her phone, scrolling mindlessly. A notification popped up on Miles' phone beside her, and curiosity got the better of her. It was an email. Subject line, unauthorized use of corporate funds. Response required. Her heart skipped. Another email followed, this one in French, but she could decipher the words cour, ordonnance, gel deactives. Her heart thudded. Frozen assets? She slipped out of bed and padded to the bathroom, scrolling through his inbox as more messages poured in. 10 minutes later, a knock echoed through the suite. Miles stirred, grumbling, and Ava rushed out of the bathroom, wide-eyed. "There's someone at the door," she said. Miles pulled on his robe, muttering about early deliveries. He opened the door to find 2 hotel security officers and a concierge holding the red-sealed envelope. The officer spoke calmly, but with authority. "Monsieur Grant, we've been asked to present this document. It concerns an immediate suspension of financial privileges tied to this suite." "What?" Miles blinked, the sleep clearing from his eyes like fog lifting from a battlefield. He took the envelope, ripping it open. As he read the words, Order de Gel, Autorite Judiciaire Internationale, a sick feeling began to grow in his gut. Behind him, Ava's voice was small but sharp. "Miles, what did you do?" He looked up, realizing the room was too quiet, the world suddenly too real. The curtain had lifted. Paris, once his escape, now felt like a trap. And Elise, the woman he believed he had left behind, had just played her first card. And it was only the beginning. If you were in her shoes, watching your ex vanish to Paris with someone new, what would you have done? Would you confront him, or stay silent and strike smarter? Let me know in the comments. And if this story has you hooked already, hit that like button, subscribe, and remember, your support keeps stories like this alive. The next morning, Paris looked like a city from a dream. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse suite, casting golden beams across the crisp white sheets and expensive marble floors. Down below, the world moved with that elegant indifference only Parisians could pull off, with scooters buzzing past bakeries and lovers strolling hand in hand by the Seine. Inside the suite, however, the atmosphere was shifting. Miles stood shirtless by the window, coffee in one hand, his other tapping absently at the glass as if trying to summon control over the chaos already beginning to swirl beneath the surface. The envelope from the night before still lay open on the desk, its red seal broken like a warning flare. He hadn't told Ava much about it, only that it was a misunderstanding, probably a glitch, and that he'd have it sorted by noon. She had looked skeptical but nodded, choosing to believe him. That was the beauty of being with someone who wanted to believe in the illusion. He gave her just enough truth to keep her calm, but not enough to arm her. He spent the morning on calls, pacing the hallway in crisp linen pants, his voice low and sharp. His corporate bank manager hadn't returned his messages, and the overseas account he tried to access was now requiring biometric verification he didn't remember setting up. Every attempt he made to restore normalcy was met with another locked door. Still, he wasn't ready to panic. He'd weathered storms before. This was just another inconvenience. Meanwhile, Ava was lounging in a plush chair near the suite's fireplace, wearing a silk robe and scrolling through boutiques on her phone. She didn't ask many questions at first. She knew better than to pry. Miles didn't like to be challenged. It made him defensive, and when he got defensive, he got mean. So she played the role, sweet and soft-spoken, but inside, her curiosity was sharpening. Something felt off. The night before, he had seemed rattled, genuinely caught off guard by the envelope. And for all his bravado, there was tension in his jaw now, a stiffness in his movements that betrayed the image of the carefree millionaire he tried so hard to maintain. "Should we still go to Chanel this afternoon?" she asked, watching him with careful eyes. Miles turned, forcing a smile, and nodded. "Of course," he said. "And dinner at Lemuri's tonight." Nothing's changed. But something had changed. Ava saw it. She saw it when he tried to use his card to order breakfast, and the transaction failed. She saw it when he asked her if she could spot the bill just for today. It was the first time he'd asked her to pay for anything. The man who had once chartered a helicopter just to avoid Parisian traffic was now whispering with the concierge about credit limits. She didn't say anything. Not yet. But her mind was racing. They walked the Champs-Élysées that afternoon like a power couple in a magazine spread. Tourists turned to stare. Him with his perfectly tailored suit, her in heels that clicked like punctuation marks against the pavement. But beneath the glamour, Ava was analyzing every detail. The way he kept glancing at his phone. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes. The way he deflected questions about his business with vague phrases like transitioning leadership and global restructuring. At Chanel, she tried on a pair of earrings. Diamonds, subtle but unmistakably expensive. She loved them, but when Miles asked the saleswoman to put them aside for later, Ava knew something was wrong. He never waited before. Not with her. Not with anything. She excused herself to the restroom and, once inside, locked the door and opened his tablet, which he had left in her bag earlier that day. What she saw wasn't just concerning, it was alarming. Dozens of unread emails from financial institutions, flagged alerts, and a long message from his CFO back in New York that began with the words, "We need to talk about the fund withdrawals." She returned to the boutique with her expression neutral, but her mind was a storm. Miles didn't notice. He was too busy pretending everything was fine. They left without buying anything, and Ava slipped her arm through his like nothing had happened. That night, at dinner, she ordered wine. He stuck with water. She asked questions in a casual tone, the kind that didn't sound accusatory but were designed to dig. "So," she began, "this company card, it's through your business account, right?" He hesitated for just a moment, then smiled. "Of course. It's all part of the corporate package. Perks of being the boss." Ava nodded, watching him lie with practiced ease. But the crack in the mirror was widening, and she had no intention of being caught in the reflection when it shattered. Back in New York, Elise sat in her lawyer's office, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The woman across from her, Monique de Rosier, was a legal powerhouse. French, brilliant, and unforgiving. She had spent the last 5 years leading high-profile investigations into international financial fraud, and now, she was working for Elise. "He's using company funds," Monique said calmly, showing her the flagged wire transfers. "Luxury hotels, private excursions, and discretionary purchases, all without board approval. We have enough now to escalate. Once the Parisian courts approve the freeze extension, he'll be locked out of every account linked to his name within the EU." Elise nodded, her fingers wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "He won't see it coming." Monique raised an eyebrow. "You're surprisingly composed, considering what he did." "I've had time," Elise replied. "Rage doesn't last forever. But clarity does. He took everything from me. My trust. My time. My voice. This isn't about revenge. This is about balance." By the time Miles and Ava returned to the hotel that night, the air between them had shifted. She didn't kiss him. He didn't offer. They walked into the suite like two people trying not to acknowledge the weight pressing down on them. Miles excused himself to the balcony, phone to his ear, muttering something about lawyers and wire transfers. Ava sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror, suddenly unsure who she was in this story. She thought she had won. Thought she'd seduced a man with wealth, power, and access. But now she wasn't sure if she was his lover or just another one of his mistakes. And as she picked up the folder he had tossed on the desk earlier, the one with the French judicial seal. She realized the truth wasn't just ugly. It was criminal, and she wasn't about to go down with him. Not in Paris. Not anywhere. Not ever. It was nearly midnight in Manhattan when Elise closed the last folder on her kitchen table. The air was still, interrupted only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car down below. She lived on the 15th floor of an aging but charming building on the Upper West Side now, a far cry from the glass and steel palace she used to share with Miles. But the space felt hers. Everything in it, from the second-hand books on the shelves to the chipped ceramic mugs in the cabinet, had been chosen or kept by her. There was no room for excess anymore. Only truth. Only purpose. Only what mattered. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner, casting soft golden light across the papers she'd been studying for hours. Financial statements, tax returns, wire transfer confirmations, and copies of internal memos from the company Miles once said would build them a legacy. All of it had passed through Elise's hands before, back when she'd handled the foundation's finances, before he pushed her out with fake kindness and a carefully staged restructuring. He had claimed it was about optics, but she knew better. It was about control. Miles didn't want a woman who could question him. He wanted a trophy. Elise had been too smart, too steady, too unwilling to play his game with a smile. Her eyes drifted to a photo on her desk. Her and Miles at their wedding, 10 years ago, frozen in time. He looked younger then. So did she. Less guarded. More foolish. She didn't hate him. She had tried to, many times. But hate burned fast and left ash. What she felt now was something more enduring. Not vengeance. Not spite. A cold, clean sense of justice. Of correction. Of finally being heard in a language Miles understood. Consequence. Her phone vibrated gently against the table. A text from Monique. We're ready. Court files tomorrow. You'll be copied on the motion. Elise stared at the message for a moment before locking the screen. She stood, stretched her arms above her head, and walked slowly to the window. The city glowed beneath her, endless and alive. Somewhere across the ocean, Miles was probably asleep on a mattress that cost more than her car. He believed he was untouchable, unreachable, immune. He believed she had gone silent because she was broken. He had no idea she was simply waiting for the right moment to speak. Weeks earlier, Elise had walked into Monique's office dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, her hair pulled into a low, clean bun, her face unreadable. It had taken her months to work up to that meeting. Not because she doubted her decision, but because she wanted to be ready. She had spent the first few weeks after the separation drowning in grief and disbelief, replaying every moment, every dinner, every private humiliation disguised as love. Miles had made her feel invisible, like a fixture in the background of his success story. But now, she had documents. She had data. She had allies. Monique had met her with a handshake and a knowing look. I've seen your file, she'd said. And I'll be honest, most women come in here angry, heartbroken, desperate for revenge. You're different. I'm not interested in revenge, Elise had replied. I'm interested in truth. They'd gotten to work that same day. Monique had access to investigators, accountants, and digital analysts who combed through every email, every transfer, every seemingly innocent expense report. Miles had been sloppy, maybe not enough to land him in prison, yet, but certainly enough to implicate him in misuse of company funds, especially those used overseas, outside the bounds of direct corporate oversight. The Paris trip was a gift. All Elise had to do was wait for him to sign his own confession with a dinner bill. Now, back in her quiet apartment, Elise allowed herself a moment to breathe. She sat on the worn armchair near the balcony and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, her attorney would file an emergency motion in French court to enforce a freeze on all non-salaried assets tied to Miles's corporate entities. The language was bureaucratic, but the effect was clear. His cards would stop working. His hotel would be notified. He'd be flagged by financial institutions as a liability. And the best part? She wouldn't have to lift a finger. Everything would happen through systems and protocols he used to believe only served him. She thought of Ava then. The mistress. She had no ill will toward her. Ava was a symptom, not the disease. A younger woman seduced by power, by wealth, by the lie that Miles always sold with such polish. Elise had been that woman once. She knew the script. What Ava didn't know yet was what it felt like when the music stopped, when the money dried up, when the mask slipped. when the man who promised the world handed you silence and a cold shoulder instead. Monique's team had done their homework. They had identified Ava's name on multiple account transfers, traced from corporate accounts to personal debit cards in her name, all under the guise of marketing expenses. Elise had smiled when she saw the breakdown. $1,000 for a dress, $3,000 for a spa weekend, $6,000 for private language classes. Every dollar traced, every receipt a breadcrumb leading to the real story. It had taken Elise years to stop questioning herself, to believe that she wasn't the problem, that her instincts hadn't failed her, that being calm and rational in the face of manipulation didn't make her weak. She remembered the nights Miles would come home late, reeking of scotch and secrecy, brushing off her concerns as jealousy or insecurity. She remembered how he made her feel like an outdated version of herself, someone in need of constant reinvention to stay relevant in his orbit. But now, she had stepped out of that orbit, and she was building her own gravity. Across the Atlantic, Miles was still trying to put out fires. Back-to-back calls to his CFO, his legal advisor, and the hotel's financial officer had yielded nothing but confusion. The systems were locking him out. His emails were bouncing. And most frightening of all, a message from the board chair had arrived. "We need to speak. Urgently." He was starting to sweat. Ava noticed, but didn't speak. Not yet. She was watching him, now the way a cat watches a bird that suddenly stopped flapping. There was a shift, something primal and unavoidable. She didn't understand the legalese or the complexity of what he was facing, but she understood the signs. The canceled reservations, the nervous fingers, the sudden urge to control every detail. Ava had always loved power, but she wasn't loyal to it. If Miles was falling, she had no plans to fall with him. Elise returned to her desk and carefully organized the documents into a sleek black folder. She placed the folder in her bag, then stood and walked into her bedroom, flicking off the lamp behind her. In the darkness, the city lights danced faintly across her ceiling. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel bitter. She felt ready. She had spent years in the shadows of Miles's ambition, quietly supporting a dream that had never included her. Now, she had her own plan. And when the moment came, and it was coming fast, he wouldn't even see her hand in it. Not at first. Not until it was too late. Because the most dangerous person in any story is never the one yelling. It's the one you forget is in the room. And Elise was done being forgotten. The afternoon sun in Paris poured in thick through the tall arched windows of the suite, casting honey-colored light over the polished floor. It might have been romantic, if not for the silence that had fallen between Miles and Ava. She sat near the edge of the bed, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone as if looking for an escape, her expression unreadable. Miles paced near the minibar, a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand, eyes darting between his phone and the folder with the French court seal that now lived on the desk like an unwelcome guest. His world, once so meticulously controlled, was beginning to fray at the edges, and he could feel the unraveling with every unanswered call and bounced email. Ava had said very little since the incident at the hotel reception the night before. She'd asked questions, light ones, phrased delicately, but Miles had dodged them with vague explanations, masking panic with charm. It wasn't working anymore. She was no fool. Her silence wasn't indifference, it was calculation. He finally turned to her. "What's on your mind?" Ava looked up slowly, her gaze cool. "I'm wondering how you plan to pay for the rest of this trip," she said flatly. "Because unless the French government starts accepting promises as currency, we might have a problem." Miles set his drink down with more force than necessary. "It's temporary," he snapped, then caught himself and adjusted his tone. "There was a clerical error. Some idiot in New York hit the wrong switch. I'm handling it." She raised an eyebrow. "You always say that." "I'm handling it. But I've seen your inbox, Miles. You're not handling anything. You're reacting." He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. She was right. The emails weren't just bad, they were explosive. The CFO back home had flagged several transactions, and the legal team had warned that misuse of corporate funds, especially internationally, could land them in regulatory hot water. And now, with Elise involved, there were legal terms being thrown around that made his stomach turn. Misappropriation, fiduciary breach, intent to defraud. He tried to shift the conversation. "Don't act like you're a bystander in all this. You've been living off the perks." She laughed, sharp and joyless. "You mean the hotel rooms and handbags?" You made those decisions. I didn't ask you to funnel money into my account. That's on you. He walked toward the window, trying to steady his breath. The Paris skyline, once a symbol of escape, now looked like a distant prison. You think Elise is behind this? He asked quietly, almost to himself. Ava stood and walked to the desk. She picked up the legal envelope and held it out. This seal isn't some random court. This is international enforcement. You think this just fell out of the sky? Someone built this case, Miles. Someone who knows you, who's been watching and waiting. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The truth was sinking in. Elise. It had to be. She had access to everything. She always had. When they were married, she had handled the corporate audits, the foundations, the philanthropic partnerships. She knew which stones to look under. He'd underestimated her. Again, Ava continued, her voice softer now. You know what really scares me? It's not the legal stuff. It's that you've been playing games with people's lives, and I don't even think you realize it. You walk into a room and make everyone orbit around you. And when things fall apart, you blame the gravity. Miles said nothing. He wanted to argue, but all he could feel was the weight pressing on his chest, heavier by the second. Later that evening, while Miles tried to contact a lawyer in New York willing to navigate French courts at short notice, Ava took a walk through the city alone. She wandered the narrow streets of the Marais, her heels clicking softly against ancient cobblestones, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses spilling out from open cafe doors. She thought about what had led her here, what she had traded to stand next to a man like him. The glamour, the power, the illusion of security. But now that illusion was cracked, and what she saw beneath it chilled her. He was unraveling, and it wasn't just financial. It was personal. There was a desperation in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The kind that comes when someone who's always been in control realizes he never really was. Back in New York, Elise met with Monique one last time before the motion was officially submitted. They sat in a quiet office overlooking the East River, the city lights flickering on one by one as dusk crept over the skyline. Monique slid a folder across the desk. This will trigger the asset freeze across all EU-linked accounts within 48 hours, she said. It'll also notify any partners he's worked with internationally. The moment it's filed, everything shifts. Elise nodded, her voice low but resolute. Do it. Monique paused, then said, he's going to fight back. Elise met her gaze. Let him. There had been a time when the thought of confrontation would have paralyzed her, when she would have stayed up at night wondering if she'd gone too far. But not anymore. Now, the only question that haunted her was why she hadn't done it sooner. Miles had built a kingdom on silence, on charm and shadows. And Elise had once believed that staying quiet was noble, that keeping peace was a virtue. Now she understood. Silence only serves those who are already winning. When she left the office that night, Elise didn't go home. She walked instead, the cool spring wind brushing her face, her steps steady. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. A message from Monique. It's done. The order has been served. Elise stopped and stared up at the skyline, her heart pounding in a quiet, steady rhythm. She wasn't sure what Miles was doing in that exact moment, but she could imagine it. The confusion, the disbelief, the first flickers of fear. He'd be calling his bank, shouting at assistants, demanding answers. But the answers were already written. In legal documents. In bank statements. In evidence. The kind that doesn't apologize. The kind that doesn't flinch. Across the ocean, Miles was doing exactly that. Arguing with a French hotel manager, his voice growing louder with each sentence. Ava stood to the side, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a strange mix of disbelief and clarity. She had loved him once, or at least the idea of him. Now, she saw the man behind the suit. A man cornered by his own ego. When they finally returned to the suite, Miles slammed the door behind them. It's a mistake, he said. I'll fix it. You'll see. But Ava didn't answer. She turned away from him, heading toward the bathroom. Before closing the door, she said over her shoulder, You didn't just lose money, Miles. You lost credibility. And you're starting to lose me. The door clicked shut, and Miles was left alone in the silence. He looked around the suite, once a symbol of indulgence, now a cage. The documents were still on the desk, the bourbon still untouched. He sank into the chair and rubbed his temples, his thoughts spinning. Elise. She had done this. But how? And why now? He didn't know yet. But he was starting to realize something terrifying. She hadn't disappeared. She'd just gone quiet. And now, she was speaking in a language he couldn't ignore. The evening air in Paris was thick with the scent of spring flowers, car exhaust, and perfume. The city had begun to glow under the hazy amber of twilight, and everything looked romantic, at least from the outside. From the rooftop terrace of the Hotel de l'Opéra, where waiters glided silently across polished marble, balancing trays of oysters and champagne flutes, it was easy to pretend the world was perfect. It was exactly the kind of scene Miles had envisioned when he planned this escape. His suit was tailored, his watch glinted in the last rays of sunlight, and his smile, at least the one he wore for others, remained intact. But beneath it all, tension coiled inside him like a wire pulled too tight. The cracks were no longer beneath the surface. They were everywhere. Ava sat across the table in a sleek black dress that fit her like it had been poured onto her skin. Her makeup was flawless, her expression composed. But she wasn't relaxed. Not tonight. Her eyes followed Miles like a hawk, watching for tells. She hadn't spoken much since the last confrontation, only offering clipped responses and polite nods. She was performing now, and Miles knew it. They both were. This dinner was less about celebration and more about image, his attempt to reclaim control, to show her, and perhaps himself, that everything was still in his hands. He had arranged for a private table on the balcony, live jazz below, and a chilled bottle of vintage wine he hoped would set the right tone. But the moment the sommelier asked for a card to confirm the reservation, the illusion crumbled again. Miles hesitated, his hand frozen halfway to his wallet. He knew what would happen, but he had to try. He handed over his backup card, the one tied to an older business expense account. The sommelier returned less than a minute later with a strained smile and a quiet apology. "I'm afraid this card has been declined, monsieur. Would you like to use another?" Ava didn't speak, but the silence between them screamed. Miles pulled out his personal credit card and hoped. Another refusal. A flicker of pity passed through the waiter's eyes, quickly hidden behind professional neutrality. "Perhaps there has been a mistake," the man offered helpfully. "Would Madame prefer to use hers?" Ava looked at Miles. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just stared, then reached slowly into her clutch and handed over her own card. "Of course," she said calmly. "Let's not keep the chef waiting." The sommelier disappeared, and Miles leaned forward, his voice low. "I'll fix this. It's just a banking issue. Something to do with the time zone." "Sure," Ava replied, her voice quiet and even. "Because time zones make cards decline." He didn't respond. What could he say? He'd lied. Again, and this time the consequences were playing out under the glow of crystal chandeliers and curious glances from nearby tables. She wasn't stupid. She had given him the benefit of the doubt for days. That benefit had now expired. The dinner dragged on, course after course arriving with less and less enthusiasm from either of them. Miles barely touched his food. Ava barely touched her wine. The weight of their silence made the luxurious setting feel like a prison, each polished surface reflecting their deteriorating reality back at them. He caught her staring at him once, long and quiet, like she was trying to see through him. When their eyes met, she looked away first, but not before he caught the truth in her expression. She was already halfway gone. Later, in the elevator back to their suite, Miles tried to make light of it. "You know," he said, forcing a grin, "this'll be a great story one day. The time in Paris when everything that could go wrong did. We'll laugh about it." Ava didn't even look at him. "You think this is about inconvenience?" she asked, voice cold. "You committed fraud, Miles. You've been lying to me, lying to your board, and dragging me into it like I'm just another asset." He stepped toward her, defensive. "That's not what happened. It's not that simple." "But it is," she cut in. "You used company funds for personal indulgence. You moved money through dummy accounts and paid for our trip with business cards. And you left your ex-wife to clean up your mess while you played house with me in Paris." The elevator doors opened. Ava stepped out without waiting for him, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. Back in the suite, she threw her purse on the bed and began gathering her things. Miles followed her in, panic beginning to rise in his throat. "Wait, where are you going?" "I don't know yet," she said without looking up. "Somewhere not paid for with embezzled funds." He reached for her wrist. "Ava, come on. Don't do this now. We can talk about this. Just give me time." She pulled away. "Time's up, Miles. You thought you were the smartest person in the room. But Elise was always smarter. She gave you enough rope to hang yourself, and you did. He was stunned into silence. Ava walked to the desk, picked up the court papers, and handed them to him. She didn't come after you with rage. She came with receipts. That's the difference between a woman who's emotional and a woman who's prepared. He sat down heavily, the papers trembling in his hands. They felt heavier now, as if they carried the weight of every lie he'd told, every shortcut he'd taken. The fraud allegations were clear, detailed, and devastating. The document outlined asset freezes, ongoing investigations, and pending board actions. Elise's name appeared at the bottom, formal and distant. Ava zipped her suitcase. You used me, but I won't let you drag me down too. He stood quickly. Ava, I love you. She laughed, one sharp note that cut through the room. You don't love anything, Miles. You just collect people until they stop being useful. He watched as she wheeled her suitcase toward the door. Her hand paused on the handle. Then she turned back one last time. You should know something. Elise didn't just file a legal order. She filed it from the same office you used to brag about when you were still mentoring her in finance. She played the long game, and she won. Then she was gone. The door closed with a soft click that echoed through the now cavernous silence of the suite. Miles stood alone, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass behind him. His reflection stared back at him from the window. Hollow eyes, expensive clothes. A man who had built his empire on charm and shortcuts, now left with nothing but the sound of his own undoing. And far away, back in New York, Elise sat quietly with a glass of wine, her phone face down, her expression unreadable. The documents had been delivered. The message had been received. And as she stared out into the skyline she used to share with him, she allowed herself a single thought. He would never see her coming. And that was the point all along. The hour was well past midnight when the second knock came. Not a loud, impatient one like a guest who's forgotten their key, but sharp, deliberate, measured enough to signal authority. Miles sat on the edge of the bed, hunched forward, still wearing the dress shirt he'd thrown on hours ago. It was wrinkled now, the sleeves unbuttoned and rolled halfway up his arms, and the top buttons hung open like he couldn't decide whether he was still in control or simply too tired to pretend. The silence in the room had grown unbearable since Ava walked out. He hadn't turned on the TV. He hadn't poured himself a drink. He just sat there with the court envelope open on the nightstand and the last message from his CFO still glowing on the phone screen. Emergency board meeting called. You are required to attend via video tomorrow. We advise you to have counsel present. The knock came again. For a few seconds, he didn't move. It felt like he could stop whatever was coming by ignoring it. But that wasn't how this worked, and deep down, he knew it. He rose slowly and walked to the door, running a hand through his hair to smooth it out, as if presentation still mattered. When he opened the door, he was greeted by two figures, one in a tailored hotel uniform, the other in a suit so sharp it looked pressed into place by silence. A third person stood slightly behind them, a French officer with the quiet, alert posture of someone used to witnessing endings. Monsieur Miles Grant, the suited man asked in near-perfect English. He held up a wallet bearing a badge. I am here to present you with an extension of the asset freeze initiated earlier. This is in compliance with the Cour d'Appel de Paris. Miles blinked. What? That was already handled. I received the notice yesterday. The man nodded once. That was preliminary. This is formal enforcement. You are now legally restricted from accessing any account linked to the named entities in this document, including, but not limited to, corporate, joint, and secondary accounts. Your current hotel accommodations have been notified and will require alternate payment. If none is available within the hour, you will be required to vacate. I don't understand, Miles muttered, his voice thinning. I'm an American citizen. This shouldn't be, correct, the man replied calmly. But your transactions crossed borders. Your corporate funds were used within EU jurisdiction. This makes it our concern. The hotel manager stepped forward. Monsieur Grant, may I speak with you privately? Miles looked between them, then stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind him just enough to offer an illusion of control. The manager lowered his voice. We are truly sorry for the inconvenience, sir. But due to the freeze and the declining transactions today, the hotel cannot extend credit. We have already covered one night's stay as a courtesy. Without immediate payment, we are legally obligated to ask you to make other arrangements. Miles swallowed hard. I have a card in my bag. A personal account. It's US-based. It should still work. The manager nodded. If that's the case, we can process it now. He moved quickly, almost too quickly, back into the suite. He dug through his leather bag, ignoring the papers and electronics, until he found the familiar black Amex. Not the corporate one. This one was supposed to be untouched. He handed it over and waited, arms crossed tightly over his chest. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. The manager's device beeped. Declined, he said, not unkindly. Do you have another? A wave of heat crashed over Miles like a fever. He grabbed his phone and opened the app. The account was still there. Balance, $0. A red bar across the top read, restricted pending review. Contact compliance team. He could feel himself unraveling. The manager cleared his throat. Again, sir. We will allow you an hour to resolve the situation. The officer stepped in. Please understand that this is not punitive. You are not under arrest. However, any attempt to access or reroute frozen funds will be considered a violation. The men left, leaving Miles in the doorway of a room that didn't feel like his anymore. He stepped inside and closed the door slowly, as if trying to keep the collapse from leaking into the hallway. He stumbled back to the desk and dropped into the chair. He didn't notice his hands were shaking until he tried to send an email to his lawyer. His mind buzzed with static, legal language he barely understood, memories of Elise standing beside him in boardrooms, back when she knew the ins and outs of everything they did together. He had pushed her aside like a tired shadow, told her she wasn't built for this world. She'd built the case that was now tearing his world apart. Somewhere between his thoughts and the static, he opened a drawer in the desk, looking for something. Maybe a pen, maybe just order. Instead, he found a hotel stationery pad. He tore a sheet and stared at it blankly before scribbling the only thing he could bring himself to write. This isn't over. Then, as if ashamed of his own bravado, he crumpled it and threw it into the trash. Minutes dragged into an hour. No response from his legal team. His financial advisor sent a vague message suggesting he remain calm and wait until business hours in New York resumed. He laughed bitterly. The world doesn't pause for time zones. Not when your entire life is dissolving. Eventually, a quiet knock returned. Not loud, not aggressive. Just a tap of inevitability. Miles opened the door to find the same hotel manager, accompanied by a concierge. We've arranged a room at one of our sister properties nearby, sir, the manager said. More modest accommodations, but comfortable. Miles didn't protest. He simply nodded and turned back inside. He packed his belongings in silence. The clothes that once made him feel invincible now looked ridiculous. Sharp suits, designer loafers, monogrammed cologne bottles. He zipped his luggage and followed the concierge down the hall, every step echoing like a funeral march. As they passed the front desk, the manager offered one last nod. I hope this matter is resolved soon, sir. Miles didn't respond. Outside, the Paris air was cooler than he remembered. Not cold, but biting in a way that demanded awareness. The city buzzed in the distance, headlights on the Seine, the low rumble of a distant metro, the laughter of people in cafes who still had something to laugh about. His new room was smaller, tucked behind a quiet street in the Latin Quarter. The concierge handed him a key, an actual metal key, not a card, and wished him good night. The room was clean but basic. A double bed, a desk, a small window that didn't quite close right. No view, no minibar, no marble floors. He sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand. He tried Ava again, straight to voicemail. Then he opened his email. Dozens of unread messages, each one worse than the last. Internal alerts. External inquiries. One from a board member simply titled, "What were you thinking?" He didn't open that one. Instead, he stared at the screen until it blurred, then turned it over and dropped it beside him. The weight of exhaustion was creeping in, but he couldn't sleep. Not yet. Because somewhere out there, Elise was awake. And she wasn't wondering what he was thinking. She knew exactly what he had done, and she was done waiting for him to realize it. The morning after the freeze order felt different, not just colder, but emptier. The hum of Paris beyond the thin window of Miles's new hotel room had lost its charm, stripped of the romantic fantasy he had wrapped himself in just days earlier. He stared at the cracked ceiling as the early light crawled across it, listening to a distant horn echo off the wet cobblestones below. The city didn't care that he was unraveling. It never did. And neither, it seemed, did anyone else. Ava hadn't returned any of his messages. His lawyer had sent a single word at dawn, reviewed. Nothing more. There was no apology, no plan, no magic reversal. He dragged himself from bed, the sheets tangled like ropes around his legs, and moved to the bathroom. His reflection startled him. His hair was disheveled, his skin pale, his eyes bloodshot and heavy with sleepless regret. He looked nothing like the man who had stepped off a private jet only days ago, smug with certainty. He splashed water on his face and tried to fix himself, but the mirror kept showing him the truth. By mid-morning, he had dressed in jeans and a rumpled button-up, the best he could piece together from a suitcase now depressingly inadequate. Gone were the designer pieces and polished cufflinks. What he wore now made him feel ordinary, worse, exposed. He called Ava again, for what must have been the 10th time. Still voicemail. He didn't leave another message. He stepped out into the street, the air damp and cool, and made his way toward the cafe where they had first had brunch when they arrived in Paris. He didn't know if she would be there, but he hoped. He didn't know if he had anything left to say that would matter, but he had to try. Maybe it wasn't about winning anymore. Maybe it was just about facing what he'd tried so hard to outrun. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few locals sipping espressos and reading newspapers. And there she was. Ava sat at a table near the window, coffee in one hand, her gaze focused outside, detached. She didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she looked prepared, as though she'd expected this confrontation, perhaps even rehearsed it in her head. Miles approached cautiously. "Can I sit?" She didn't answer right away. After a moment, she gestured to the chair opposite her without looking at him. He sat down, clearing his throat. "I know things look bad," he began, keeping his voice low. "But I can fix this." She sipped her coffee, still not meeting his eyes. "You can't fix what you don't admit, Miles." "I admit I made mistakes," he replied. "But this isn't just my fault. Elise, she's behind this. She weaponized the courts against me. She planned this." Ava finally looked at him. Her expression was tired, not angry. "You're still trying to make this about her." "It is about her. She's the one pulling the strings. She's holding you accountable," Ava said. "There's a difference." He leaned forward, his tone hardening. "You think I'm the only one who's ever blurred a line for convenience? You think the board hasn't done worse and swept it under the rug?" "This isn't about them," she said. "It's about you. You didn't just blur lines, Miles, you erased them. You built a world where everything revolved around you, where everyone had a role to play except you. Elise supported you for years. You discarded her. I supported you here, and you used me. You didn't love either of us. You loved what we gave you." He sat back, stunned. There was no venom in her voice, no performance, just truth. And the truth, more than anything, was what he couldn't stand. "You act like I'm some monster," he muttered. "You're not a monster," Ava said. "You're just hollow. You don't even see it, but Elise does. That's why she was able to bring all of this down. You underestimated her. You always did." Miles was silent. Her words rang in his ears long after she stopped speaking. He stared at the cup of coffee in front of him, untouched and growing cold. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he finally whispered. "But it did," she replied. "And pretending it was someone else's fault won't change it." They sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of Paris life passing them by, scooters, laughter, a dog barking in the distance. Miles tried to think of something else to say, something to claw back a sliver of control. But there was nothing left to cling to. No card to play. No lie smooth enough to stick. Ava stood. "I'm leaving tomorrow. My flight's at noon." He looked up, alarmed. "Where are you going?" "Home," she said. "To somewhere that isn't tangled up in your mess." "Stay," he said quickly. "I need." "You don't need me," she interrupted. "You need a witness. Someone to stand next to you, so you can pretend you're still standing." "I won't do that anymore." She walked away, heels clicking against the tiled floor until the door closed behind her, leaving Miles alone with the echo of her departure. He didn't move for a long time. The waitress came by to clear her cup. She asked if he wanted anything. He shook his head. He eventually made his way back to the hotel. His steps were slower now, not from exhaustion, but from realization. He wasn't just losing things. He was being revealed. And what was left underneath scared even him. Later that afternoon, he received another email from the board. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following morning. They would be voting on whether to suspend him from his executive position, pending investigation. The language was cold, clinical, but the meaning was clear. His empire was slipping from his fingers. He sat in the modest hotel room for hours, staring at nothing, letting the silence stretch. And somewhere in New York, Elise received a notification. The court documents had been acknowledged. The freeze was officially extended. Her attorney sent her a simple message. He's received everything. Elise didn't celebrate. She didn't pour a drink or share the news. She simply looked out the window of her apartment at the city skyline, her thoughts silent but steady. She hadn't just set a trap. She had built a mirror. And now, Miles was finally seeing himself in it. Miles woke the next morning to the shrill vibration of his phone against the nightstand. For a brief second, before his brain could catch up to reality, he thought it might be Elise. Somewhere in the back of his mind, buried under layers of ego and deflection, there still lived the boyish fantasy that the woman he had abandoned might still care enough to call. But it wasn't her. It was a calendar reminder, an automated notification that the board meeting would begin in 30 minutes. Video conference. Mandatory attendance. No excuses. He dragged himself out of bed, shoulders heavy, jaw tight, eyes gritty from a night without sleep. The room was small and the air stale. The single window let in a muted gray light. Not quite sun, not quite storm. Outside, Paris moved indifferently, tourists clinging to maps, locals wrapped in scarves and routine. He envied them. Their lives were their own. His, once curated to perfection, now sat in pieces. He dressed in the best of what remained. A navy blazer wrinkled from poor packing, a white shirt that still smelled faintly of last week's cologne. He shaved quickly, ignoring the cut that opened just below his jawline. It stung, but he welcomed it. At least it meant he could still feel something. The hotel Wi-Fi struggled as he opened the video call link. The screen flickered before settling into a gallery of familiar faces. Board members, legal counsel, the CFO. Some wore poker faces, others looked impatient. No one looked warm. Miles sat straighter, cleared his throat, and forced himself into what remained of his confident persona. "Good morning," he began. The chairman, a man named Harrington, didn't return the greeting. "We'll keep this brief," he said. "You've been made aware of the court filings. We've reviewed the financials. We've consulted counsel. We have grounds to suspend you from all executive operations until further notice." Miles opened his mouth to protest, but the chairman raised a hand. "This isn't a debate, Miles. It's a formality. The damage to the brand is already significant. The media has started sniffing around, and shareholders are asking questions. I can explain everything," Miles insisted. This was a miscalculation, a temporary lapse in how expenses were managed, but it's being addressed. "It's not," said the CFO flatly. "You used company funds to finance a personal vacation. You issued unauthorized transfers. You violated policy. Elise may have delivered the evidence, but the actions were yours." The mention of her name sent a pulse of heat up Miles's spine. She was still in the room, even without being present. That was her power now. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was louder than anything he could say. "I built this company," Miles said, trying to keep his voice steady. "When it was bleeding, I put up my own capital. When it nearly collapsed in 2015, I saved it. You all know that. And now you're bringing it down," Harrington replied. "You're a liability, Miles. Until the investigation concludes, you're out." The call ended without ceremony. No farewell, no good luck. Just blank screens and Miles's reflection staring back at him in the glassy black of the monitor. He sat motionless for several minutes, the silence pressing down on him like gravity had doubled. His empire, the thing he had sacrificed people for, was no longer his. Later, he tried to call Elise. Not to apologize. Not even to justify. He didn't know what he would have said if she picked up. But she didn't. He wasn't blocked. He made sure of that. But she didn't answer. Not after the first ring. Not after the third. She simply didn't come to the phone. And that, more than anything, gutted him. Because indifference was always worse than rage. At least rage means you still matter. He called again later that evening. Then again the next morning. Nothing. Each ring left a deeper mark. Each silence a louder rejection. He was used to reactions, tears, anger, fights, even begging. But this was precision. Elise wasn't punishing him. She was erasing him. And the absence of her voice filled every room he walked into, every breath he took. He turned on the TV just for sound, just to drown the echo of his own thoughts. It didn't help. He left the hotel only once that day. He walked past the luxury stores he once flaunted, past the restaurants he could no longer afford, past couples laughing over wine and crepes. He ended up on a bench near the Pont Neuf, watching the river drift by with painful slowness. The world had not changed, but he had. Or maybe he was only now beginning to see who he really was. A man alone. A man who had mistaken noise for connection, wealth for power, control for love. When he returned to the hotel, a letter was waiting at the front desk. No postage, no official markings. Just his name in handwriting he recognized instantly. Elise. His hand trembled slightly as he opened it. The letter wasn't long. It wasn't angry. It didn't demand an apology or offer a second chance. It was composed, graceful, exactly as she had always been. She wrote that she hoped he found peace in his own silence, that he might one day understand the value of what he lost, that she didn't want revenge, only truth. And the truth, she said, had always been quiet. But he never listened. He folded the letter carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there, staring at the wall, the hum of the city around him distant and unreachable. The next morning, when the hotel maid knocked to clean the room, she found it empty. No note, no luggage, just a perfectly made bed and a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold. Miles wasn't gone. He was just elsewhere, inside himself, lost in the space between who he was and who he might have been, searching for the version of himself he could live with, one who had learned that silence, when earned, could echo louder than 1,000 apologies. The flight back to New York was nothing like the one that brought him to Paris. No private jet, no champagne, no velvet seats, no Ava curled against his shoulder. Instead, Miles sat by the window of a commercial plane in business class, surrounded by strangers who had no idea they were sitting next to a man unraveling from the inside out. He had worn sunglasses the entire flight, not because of the light, but to hide the redness in his eyes and the heavy shadows underneath. His suit jacket didn't quite match his pants. His shoes hadn't been shined. The man who once boasted about being the most composed person in any room now looked like he had stepped out of a version of himself that no longer existed. The airport was crowded and noisy, but no one stopped to recognize him. He used to get nods, polite smiles, the occasional fan of one of his speeches or press interviews. But now, he moved like a ghost through the terminal, wheeling a modest black suitcase that looked borrowed. He didn't go home. He couldn't face that place yet. Not the doorman, not the concierge, not the penthouse that felt more like a monument to everything he'd lost. Instead, he checked into a hotel near the company's headquarters, one he used to use for guests and clients. A place that once treated him like royalty, now offering only thin smiles and neutral eyes. The board had officially voted. He was suspended indefinitely. The media had caught wind of the freeze order, and headlines were beginning to circle like vultures. Millionaire CEO faces legal scrutiny over misuse of corporate funds, one read. Another, Parisian getaway turns legal nightmare for U.S. executive. And somewhere in the middle of those headlines, Elise's name had begun to surface, not as a scorned ex-wife, but as a whistleblower, a strategist, a woman who had leveraged the system he built against him with surgical precision. He scrolled through the comments late at night, against his better judgment. People called him arrogant, reckless. Some said it was about time. Others took cheap shots, joking about him being stuck in Paris like a movie villain exposed. But the worst comments weren't the ones filled with mockery. The worst were the ones that told the truth. That he'd taken something that could have been great and ruined it with entitlement. That he'd built a kingdom on shifting sand. That his empire had always been hollow. He hadn't heard from Ava since she walked out of the cafe. She'd posted a single photo on her social media a day later. Her on a plane, sunglasses on, a subtle caption beneath. Some flights bring you home. Others bring you back to yourself. There was no mention of him. No reference to what had happened. Just a soft, poised exit. She would be fine. She had always been smart enough to know when to get out. And she got out just in time. At work, the corridors whispered without him. Staff avoided eye contact. Some emails went unanswered. Others were curt. His assistant of 4 years sent him a message that simply said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." He stared at it for a long time before deleting it. There was no apology strong enough to undo what he'd done, or what he'd let happen. In his absence, Elise had stepped in, not formally, but functionally. She had been invited to advise the compliance committee, and her insights were now being used to rebuild internal policies. The same Elise who he had once labeled as too soft for corporate strategy, too emotional for boardrooms, too grounded for the kind of world he lived in. And yet, here she was, cleaning up his mess, fixing the machine that he'd run into the ground. He learned that her letter to the board hadn't been vengeful. It had been measured, articulate, full of documented evidence and clear recommendations. She hadn't attacked him. She had presented facts. Cold, irrefutable, damning facts. And in the process, she'd done something more powerful than any revenge. She'd made herself undeniable. He sat in the hotel bar one evening, nursing a drink he could barely taste, when a former colleague approached. Michael Trent, a man who used to defer to him in meetings, always nervous, always eager to please. "Didn't expect to see you here," Michael said, sliding into the seat next to him. Miles offered a half-smile. "Yeah, I didn't expect a lot of things." Michael hesitated, then said, "They're saying Elise might take a formal advisory role." Miles sipped his drink. "She should." Michael looked surprised. "You really think so?" "She's the only one who saw the fire coming," Miles replied. "The rest of us were too busy lighting matches." There was a long pause. "You know," Michael said, "I never really knew her. I mean, outside of functions. She always seemed quiet." Miles chuckled, but there was no humor in it. She was quiet because she was watching, listening. She was always 3 moves ahead, even when I was pretending she wasn't in the game. Michael nodded, then stood. "Well, if it means anything, I hope you land on your feet." Miles watched him go. He finished his drink and ordered another, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he sat there, thinking not of what he'd lost, but of what he'd wasted. Time, trust, people who once believed in him. One morning, days later, he woke to find a letter slipped under his hotel door. No envelope, just a folded sheet of paper. He opened it slowly, recognizing the handwriting instantly. This was never about destroying you. It was about stopping the version of you that forgot what it meant to be human. If you ever remember who that man used to be, maybe you'll understand why I walked away. Maybe you'll even thank me. But don't reach out. I don't want to hear an apology. I just want to live in peace, away from your noise. Elise. He read it again and again. Then he folded it neatly and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. Not to carry as a token of shame, but as a reminder that silence wasn't just the absence of noise. Sometimes it was the loudest truth of all. The lobby of the high-rise hotel pulsed with a strange kind of rhythm, a blend of hushed conversations, the quiet hum of luggage wheels on polished floors, and the occasional chime of the elevator arriving. Morning light spilled in through the glass-paneled entrance, illuminating the marble floor like a stage set for something ceremonial, though no one seemed to notice. No one, except for Miles. He stood near the concierge desk, hunched slightly in a suit that had once symbolized power, but now hung on him like a borrowed costume. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of something he hadn't named yet. Loss, maybe, or recognition. Whatever it was, it had finally started to feel permanent. The clerk behind the counter had called his name gently, then slid a plain white envelope across the desk. No logo, no return address. Just his name, written in a clean, familiar hand. For a moment, he didn't move. It felt like opening it might unlock something he wasn't ready to face. But then again, what hadn't already been exposed? What part of his life hadn't already been stripped and laid bare for the world to dissect? He walked slowly to one of the armchairs by the window, sat down without speaking, and stared at the envelope. There was no stamp. This hadn't traveled far. Someone had dropped it off in person. That realization sent a quiet shiver through him. She had been here. Elise had stood in this very lobby, close enough to be seen if he'd only looked up. She had walked past strangers, handed her letter to a man in a uniform, and left without saying a word. That was who she had become, precise, intentional, present without spectacle. He opened the envelope with care, folding the flap back like he was handling something sacred. The paper inside was thick, smooth, the kind Elise always preferred. Her handwriting was just as he remembered it. Elegant, controlled, effortless. "Miles," it began. "By the time you read this, you'll have already understood that I was never trying to ruin you. I was trying to stop you from ruining yourself. I watched you turn into a version of yourself I no longer recognized. Someone who couldn't hear anything but applause, who built a life so loud with performance that truth couldn't survive in it. Miles read the lines slowly, each word feeling like a tap against the shell he had built over the years. You may believe I planned this as some kind of revenge. I didn't. Revenge is loud and messy. This was something else. This was closure. For you. For me. For the years I gave to a man who always assumed I would stay because I was silent. I wasn't silent because I was weak, Miles. I was silent because I was watching. And when the time came, I chose to act. He shifted in the chair, his eyes darting between the letter and the people moving around him. No one paid him any mind. He was invisible now. Just another guest with regrets in a city that had seen it all. You taught me how to listen to instincts. I used to think love meant loyalty no matter the cost. But I learned that real love, the kind worth giving, cannot exist without respect. And you stopped respecting me the moment you decided your desires were more important than your integrity. He stopped reading for a moment, the edges of the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. He remembered the night he had made that choice. The night he called Ava while Elise was still asleep in the next room. The thrill of the chase, the validation, the way Ava made him feel admired without question. He remembered how easy it had been to convince himself that he deserved it, that Elise had drifted, that she didn't understand him anymore, that he was owed something more. But now, sitting alone in a lobby that wasn't his, with nothing left to prove and no one left to pretend for, the truth landed differently. I didn't walk away because you failed. I walked away because you refused to see your failure. I gave you the benefit of the doubt, and you used it to build walls instead of bridges. You pushed away the one person who knew you beyond the titles and the wealth. And you did it thinking there would always be someone else waiting. Maybe there will be, but they won't see you the way I did. And that will never be their fault. He rubbed his thumb over the ink, as if that would somehow soften the sharpness of her words. Around him, the world kept spinning. Tourists dragged their luggage toward taxis. Couples posed for photos near the floral display. A toddler screamed as her father offered her a cookie. It was all happening, life marching forward, uncaring of who sat still among it. This letter is not an invitation. It is not an opening. It is not the beginning of something new. It's the end. Not because I hate you. I don't. But because I love myself enough now to know that I deserve more than what you gave. And I believe, somewhere under all that noise, you do too. I hope one day you find your way back to the part of you that still believes in something. Not in success, not in image, but in connection, in truth. She had signed it simply, Elise. He folded the letter slowly, deliberately, and slid it back into the envelope. He didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, because it did, but because the tears wouldn't have mattered. They wouldn't have changed anything. The damage had already been done, and Elise had moved on not with rage, but with resolution. He remained seated in that chair for what felt like an hour, maybe more. The sky outside shifted from pale to blue, and the lobby grew busier. Eventually, he stood, tucked the envelope inside his jacket, and walked toward the revolving doors. No one stopped him. No one followed. Outside, the wind blew gently against his face, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something like clarity. He had spent his whole life building an empire made of mirrors, always more concerned with how things looked than what they were. And in the end, it hadn't been taken from him. He had let it slip, piece by piece, convinced that as long as he smiled wide enough, no one would notice the cracks. But Elise had seen them. She had seen everything. And now, as he stepped onto the sidewalk and into the city he once ruled from behind glass towers, he carried nothing but the silence she left behind. A silence that said more than any argument, more than any courtroom, more than any speech he'd ever delivered. Because sometimes, the final word isn't shouted. It's written, folded, delivered in a quiet lobby. And it's the only one that echoes forever.